Glad you're all here. As I mentioned last week, we want to do this over 5 sessions, and the session tonight, looks at the formation of the UCC. So last week, if you recall, we looked at the 4 different traditions that formed the basic building blocks of what became the UCC: the Congregationalists, the Christian Connection, the German Reformed Church, and then the Evangelical Synod in America. All those 4 came together eventually to form the UCC. And so now the question is, how exactly did that come about? As you'll see from the story, it tells a lot about, it sets up the conversation of the UCC since 1957. When you see how it came about, it brings up certain issues that, pros, cons. I'm curious how you respond to them. Hopefully we'll have a lively discussion at the end as we start to consider some certain issues of polity, and we can see how it compares to the UMC. So the UCC, as I mentioned last week, is a result of the 20th century ecumenical movement. The ecumenical movement in the United States, that sort of movement of cooperation, and in the case of the UCC, merger among different Christian churches, goes back to the 19th century. And it goes back to predominantly in the 19th century, initially the foreign missionary movement. So the foreign missionary movement saw a high degree of ecumenical cooperation. So the first foreign missionary organization in the United States was actually founded by Congregationalists called the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, but it was by no way, shape, or form limited to Congregationalists. It was Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Dutch Reformed, and even others. And there was a lot of cooperation in the mission field, even after the foreign missionary organizations became increasingly denominationally focused. Those denominations had high levels of cooperation in different parts around the globe. There's a sense of we're in this together. And that togetherness manifests itself also in the world student Christian movement. So if you study in the 19th century, the rise of the student Christian movements, and that also would include like the YMCA, things like that. These were international ecumenical organizations where the World Student Christian Fellowship, which had these big conferences, brought together college students who were Christians from all different denominations. Protestant denominations, the Catholics are not involved, Protestant denominations from all over the globe. And so there's this whole sense of this bringing together of different denominations as you get into the early 20th century. Another part that comes up that's significant is by that point, the United States is already settled. So by that point, different denominations had already staked out ground in various communities around the country. And so there wasn't the same competition on the frontier that existed in the early part of the 19th century and fostered a lot of denominational competition. By the early 20th century, there's a more stable setting in the United States. So that's another sort of factor that comes into it. So you see in 1908, you have the foundation of the Federal Council of Churches, which becomes the National Council of Churches. Again, this is an effort, part of this ecumenical movement. How do we get together to do the work of God in the community? If we do it together, we're much more effective. If we try and cooperate, that's much more effective. In 1910, there was this famous conference in Edinburgh, Scotland, World Missionary Conference. And people say that's a predecessor and sort of an important first step in the eventual creation of the World Council of Churches in 1948, which still carries on to this day. I mean, this is the general spirit of the age. Another big shift that happens, and this is something that is written about most eloquently by H. Richard Niebuhr. If you probably are familiar with Reinhold Niebuhr, the longtime professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York. Reinhold was, a nationally known theologian back in an era when you actually had nationally known theologians who could be on the cover of Time magazine. His younger brother, H. Richard Niebuhr, was a professor at Yale and a brilliant man. I would highly recommend reading his books if you haven't already. But one of his early books was called The Social Sources of Denominationalism. So what Niebuhr did was he looked at different denominations and he said, hey, by the time we get to the 20th century, you could actually define denominations in the United States far more by caste, class, race, ethnicity than you can with anything having to do with theology. And so Niebuhr made an argument in the 1920s. The book was published in 1928. He made this argument in the 1920s saying that our divisions, denominational divisions in the United States, is an example of sin. It's an example of us not actually affirming that Jesus Christ is the head of the church, and that should be our direction. We tend to make big deals of our differences when a lot of these differences just aren't that different. They're really not. And when you dig down beneath the surface, there are other things going on that perpetuate these denominational differences that are not a manifestation of what we should be doing. So there's this strong call, this strong movement in the 20th century towards ecumenism, towards the bringing together of different groups. And there are different manifestations in the United States as well. So you have, obviously you have the bringing together of denominations that had split over the slavery issue. So the United Methodists, emerge. You see the Presbyterians get back together again. The Baptists didn't. Southern Baptists stayed Southern Baptists. But you see this interesting movement. And also separate from the UCC, starting around 1960, you see this consultation on church union, where the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians actually took the lead on this, about trying to bring together Protestant denominations in organic union. And we'll look at why some of these efforts later failed. But there's this spirit in the air. And the Congregationalists and the E&R Church, the Evangelical Reformed Church, had just done some mergers of their own in the 1930s. So with this being the spirit of the air, there's this whole sense of, well, should we take that bold step of bringing together denominations that really don't have the same polity structure? They're not of the same ethnicity and background. Can we actually live into what we think God is calling us to do? So in the 1930s, you had, most people date the start of the UCC to around 1937. And there in St. Louis, Missouri, you had a guy named Truman Douglas, who becomes a big figure in the congregational side. Truman Douglas was the minister of a big congregational church there. And that's also the location of one of the major seminaries of the E&R Church, the Evangelical Synod, Eden Theological Seminary, which is just outside St. Louis. And so Truman Douglas and the then president of Eden, Samuel Press, are in these discussion groups. And they're just tossing around the idea. They're saying, do you think we could get together? Do you think this is possible? And the next year, both the Congregationalists and the E&R Church met nationally every other year. And they both met on even years back then. And so the next year, in 1938, Samuel Press, who also held a position in the E&R Church nationally in terms of relationships with other churches, sends a formal note to Douglas Horton, who's then the general minister and president of the General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches, saying, hey, can we make this happen? And so they start having meetings, informal meetings. And these informal meetings by 1942, in spite of World War II, in 1942, these informal meetings all of a sudden start becoming public. And each denomination at their national gathering in 1942 appoints people to work together on a joint committee to come up with a plan to bring these two denominations together. So this is good news, okay? This is just what they're trying to do. And in 1943, the next year, this joint committee comes out with their first proposal, this basis for union that they come out with. Like, okay, here's what we have to do in order to bring the denominations together. This is what it'll look like. This is how the national, things will likely end up merging together. Here's the process we'll have to go through. They lay out this whole plan through different steps. This is what's going to happen, or could happen. And they say to themselves, gosh, if we do this right, we could have the votes done. We could have this talked through by the 44 sessions and 46. We could have the votes done, and by 1948 at the latest, the denominations could be brought together. So this is the great plan. And as often is the case, this is where things begin to get derailed. Specifically, they get derailed not from the E&R side. They get derailed from the congregational side. And again, this is significant for how the denomination conceives of itself. So this is worth thinking about. One of the ways it's talked about is that for the E&R people, which is a Presbyterian polity church, for the E&R people, the national structure, the national body of all the churches, is the church. What is the church for an ENR folks? It's the Evangelical Reformed Church, singular. The name of the denomination is the Evangelical Reformed Church, singular. And it is the church, the manifestation of, Jesus's fellowship on earth, is all those churches together, not just their local churches, but also their synods and the general synod when it meets and the national structure. That's all the church. So that's the ENR sort of perspective. For a Congregationalist, the church is always the same thing. And that is a covenanted community of local believers. That is the church. For these Congregationalists, nothing beyond that's the church. Anything beyond that is like a voluntary fellowship. You get together and sort of, oh, let's do these things together, but that's not the church. Those other structures aren't the church. The church is always the local community of covenanted believers for the Congregationalists. That's why the Congregationalists, again, it was called the Congregational Christian Churches, plural, not singular. So all of a sudden, this whole sense of these denominations coming together, and the Congregationalists start getting concerned because they're like, well, what is this going to mean for us? Are we no longer going to be congregational? Are we going to be something else? Do we have to ditch all of our history behind? All that stuff we're so proud about being descended from the Pilgrims and Puritans and all this great history that we have, are we going to have to just erase that as we join this new denomination? How's this going to work? How's this going to function? Will this national body have any authority over us? Will they be able to have a book of discipline, for instance, that's actually binding on local clergy? That's not very congregational. Is that what it's going to mean? Some people are concerned about property issues. In a Presbyterian church, again, the Presbyterian style church or presbytery owns the property. And these Congregationalists are like, over my dead body, is anyone going to say what's going to happen to our property? Or the calling of ministers or any of these things. So these divisions start to appear. And you start to have, one of the things that is pointed out also is that because there's some differences in denominations that's worth pointing out. Again, one is ethnically German, one's ethnically Anglo-Saxon, English, and there's a difference there. The Congregationalists very much saw themselves as an establishment church. They came over on the Mayflower. They own that history, that story. They're in the inner circle, the in circle, the establishment. These German churches are immigrant churches, late arrivals. In terms of their significance for American history, not that significant in terms of the movements of American history. Whereas the Congregationalists, played a key role in the start of the American Revolution, Boston Tea Party, and all that. Before the people went to go toss the tea into the harbor, where'd they meet? At Old South Church in Boston, Old South Meeting House. All that history is there. That there's a big difference in the founding of places like Harvard and Yale and the influence that they've had intellectually in the United States. That's all Congregationalists. Congregationalists proudly say, like, oh, American democracy grows out of the covenantal polity of our churches. And so there's these big differences. There were differences in theology as well. The ENR churches tend to be more orthodox in their theology. As I mentioned last week, they always looked at the Heidelberg Catechism to define theology, at least certainly on the Reform side, but also on the Evangelical Synod side. Much more traditional Orthodox theology there. Whereas the Congregationalists were always, they were the people that were the early adopters of liberal theology. People were saying the Congregationalists back then are sort of semi-Unitarian. You have big theological differences between these two different groups. There were differences in wealth, differences in class perception. There's also differences in ministry. So in the congregational side, ministry is much more seen as this preaching ministry. Back then, the Congregationalists had a number of people who were, nationally known preachers. That was a thing. Oh, you're called as a preacher. That's your main goal. Preacher, public intellectual, in the public square. Whereas in the German ENR tradition, you're fundamentally the pastor. You're the shepherd. You're shepherding your sheep. You're looking after your flock. Those pastoral relationships are primary, not necessarily the preaching thing. And so you see these differences that are there. So there are real differences between these two different denominations. And as this merger starts getting closer and closer, particularly a lot of the people in the big pulpits of the congregational churches, the wealthy churches, the big pulpits, the people who have gotten up and talked about being a congregationalist for so long, those are the churches that then lead the movement to stop the merger. And so what happens is you have this group that meets starting in 1947 and then into 1948, you start having this resistance from the Congregationalists appearing. And it starts being evident how big these differences are. And so what this group of Congregationalists do is that they insist on having this basis of union that's been laid out by this joint committee. They insist on tacking on additional interpretations. They're like, we'll take this basis of union, but with these interpretations. And central to their interpretation was that the new national body that was going to be formed was very much like the national body of the Congregational Christian Churches. In other words, it's like a national fellowship. It doesn't have any authority over the local church. And that these churches voluntarily decide whether or not they want to join in with this national body. Very different. Now, here's the tricky thing with the timing. By this point in the process, by 1948, the German ENR churches, again, they function very differently, the ENR churches. So General Synod of the ENR churches passes the basis for union. That then gets sent to all the synods, the 34 synods in the ENR church. And then once the synods vote on it, it's binding on the churches. And it's a done deal. And so this plan of union, this basis of union is already out there that they're working on and voting on. The General Synod's already voted on the ENR side. Meanwhile, the congregations are like, oh, by the way, we want these interpretations. So then the ENR side, people are like, well, do we have to then re-vote? And what do these interpretations mean? And this is where the sort of governing bodies of the national group get together. They're like, well, how do we save this? And so the way they save it is they say, well, these really are just interpretations. So you don't have to re-vote. That's fine. That's what they tell the ENR churches. Meanwhile, they go to the congregational churches and like, oh yeah, these interpretations are essential to the merger. Like, so we want you to vote on this with the interpretations in mind. Now, this is where it gets extra tricky because the executive committee, it was called the executive committee of the General Council. So the General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches is when everyone meets together, like general conference in the UMC. So the General Council was when all the delegates got together. And the group that was sort of guiding that in between meetings was called the Executive Committee of the General Council. So the Executive Committee of the General Council had openly stated that what they wanted in order to proceed was to have 75% of the churches approve the basis of union with interpretations. So in 1948, they send this out. In early 1948, they send this out to all the churches. And 72.8% approve it. So what do you do? They publicly said that they wanted 75%, and they didn't get 75%, but they got 72.9 or 72.8%. And here's the thing: what was shocking to people, at least the executive committee, is how low their participation rate was. A lot of people just didn't bother voting on it in the congregational side. They just didn't even vote. And so then the next year, when there's a special session the General Council called to approve this, they get together and they approve it, but they approve it with a significant minority voice. So it's like 20% of the people do not vote for it, are the delegates of the General Council. And the executive committee's got to decide what to do. And they're like, okay, this is good. We're moving ahead. Now, all this would be well and good, except for, again, some of these interesting things in congregational polity. And again, I'm going through this stuff because this is relevant for how the UCC gets structured. So in a congregational system, how do you have things like a pension system? How do you have a foreign missionary organization? Remember, I said last week, the Congregationalists didn't have a national denomination, a national structure, until 1871. So up until 1871, there was no national structure. Didn't exist. So how do they do national stuff? Well, the way they do it is they have independently incorporated bodies. So the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions is a Massachusetts corporation that was established in 1812. And that corporation, which has its own board of directors, carries on missionary work on behalf of all the churches. But all the churches voluntarily contribute money to that. They voluntarily get involved, but there's no formal relationship between the American board and the churches. Everything is just informal voluntary association. Same thing with the American Home Missionary Society, which is the original group set up for home missions, for planting churches in the United States. That was established in the 1820s. And again, that was an independent corporation. When the pension board is set up, it's set up as an independent corporation. All these different entities in the congregational tradition are all independent corporations. So now all of a sudden the general council votes to go ahead with the merger. What happens to all these organizations? Let's say 25% of the churches, because then what's going to happen is each of the individual churches on the congregational side have to vote. On the ENR side, once the synods voted, the 34 synods voted, it was binding. On the congregational side, each individual congregation has to vote to join this new denomination, the United Church of Christ. Well, let's say you're a congregationalist and you don't want to join, but you've been supporting these national boards for a long time. Your money is there. Your grandmother donated money to those endowments. What's going to happen to that money? So as a result of this, in early 1949, Cadman Memorial Church in New York City ends up bringing a lawsuit to stop the merger between the two denominations. And the defendant in the lawsuit is Helen Kenyon, who is the moderator of the General Council. She is named as the defendant. And so this then begins this process, and a judge in 1950 places an injunction on the merger so that until this legal case is settled, they can't carry on the merger. Everything's got to just be in pause mode for the next several years. And so things are in pause mode for the next several years until 1953. It makes it all the way up to the appellate court level. At that point, the appellate court decides on behalf of the pro-merger people. And it hinges on a very interesting argument. And so this is interesting to figure out about congregational polity, at least on the congregational side of things. The people who are anti-merger folks, they trotted out all of this stuff from the 17th century. All the writings of the early Puritans, the Cambridge Platform of 1648, all this different kind of stuff. Like, listen, this is congregational polity. It's all about the local churches. These corporations, we have a say in them as much as anyone else does. They can't just walk off. That's their argument. The argument for the pro-union forces is a little more nuanced and interesting. They argue several things. The first thing they argue is the General Council itself constitutes a covenanting body. So the General Council itself constitutes a church just as much as any of the local churches are. As a result, if the General Council decides to move, it moves as an entity. And the other thing is that congregational polity had evolved over time. It was not purely congregational by this time anyway. And this is what the pro-union people point out. They're like, this is an evolving process. Those independent boards have all been reorganized at a national level. They all have delegates that go to the General Council. They're integrally a part of the General Council, and the General Council is the one that has formed new boards since the formation of the denomination. So in fact, those boards are not independent, but integrally related to the entity that is the General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches. If the General Council votes to go, all of the General Council goes, not just the entities that have been created since the formation of the denomination, all the entities that are all an integral part and a voting part of the General Council all go with it. So those are the two sort of sides arguments made. And in the end, what happened was the pro-union forces won out. And so then In 1954, the next year, the two sort of executive committee equivalents, somewhat confusingly, the executive committee of the E&R Church is called the General Council of the E&R Church, General Council of the General Synod of the E&R Church. So the General Council of the E&R side and the executive committee of the General Council on the congregational side talk in 1954 and lay out a plan. And the plan is for everything to be approved in 1956. And then in 1957, they have their first joint General Synod, the first General Synod, which happens in June 1957 in Cleveland, and the new denomination is declared to exist. This is also interesting. Another interesting thing that should be noted about this whole merger process is that in the whole merger process, one of the questions was, well, when do we write a constitution? And on the congregational side, their whole thing is, well, we've got this organization together. The organization can't start until we have a constitution written, right? So if you go like at like a church like the one I serve, like they're like, well, where's the constitution and bylaws? That's what's the founding document of this organization. Until the constitution and bylaws are set up, we don't have anything. The E&R side is like, oh, no. And not until the new entity is formed can you begin the process of writing a constitution, because up until that point, you're under the old constitution of your former entities. There's two different sort of mindsets that go into this. The E&R mindset wins out, and they end up writing the constitution that gets presented. A draft gets presented in 1959. That General Synod in 1961, it's approved. It goes out to all the churches, and then in 1963, the new constitution and bylaws for the national church go into effect. That, with modification, are still in effect to this day. And that leads to the creation of this very interesting hybrid denomination. Now, this is where things get, tricky for the UCC after this, and some of the divisions in the church. So when the merger happened, for all the E&R churches, they all went out and ordered new signs, and they now became, rather than St. John E&R, they became St. John UCC. It was just like, boom, done. Easy choice, easy decision. What do you think happened with the congregational side? You go all throughout New England. You go all around the country. You see these churches that are congregational in their heritage. They'll say First Congregational Church of New Canaan, Connecticut. And then in small little parentheses, they might have UCC if you look really closely. But oftentimes it's not even there on the sign. You got to go to the website. And even on the website, it might not even be there. I've known people who've grown up in congregational churches. The merger happened in 1957. I know people in my generation who've grown up in a congregational church and have never heard of the United Church of Christ. Never even heard of it. Whereas in the E&R side, that would be unthinkable. Like literally the name of the church is United Church of Christ. They know what it is. Now, one of the things that was key in the merger negotiations was to maintain local church autonomy. The Congregationalists insisted on it. The local church hires and fires all its ministers, controls all of its property, that whole thing. Right? Now, in the old congregational way, each individual congregation would give money to various organizations as it saw fit. Right? But there had to be this sense of accountability to the congregations. That's why the congregations were involved in this. Everything was voluntary. So you had to make a case to the congregational churches that it was worth them donating their money. In the E&R side, there was a very different polity structure, and they just put the money right up the system. And because there was this, you're in the church and just this is what you do. You have a certain apportionment and you've got to give your apportionment up, and that goes up and you trust in the system. Well, you have a new constitution where now all that's voluntary. So over time, what do you think happened to the funding of the national structure of the church? Yeah, it's three guesses and the first two don't count. So there's some interesting dynamics. One of the things that some of the ER folks were bitter about for a long time afterwards, actually, because I talked to some ER folks, and it was like, this is 50 years later. They're like still bitter about this 50 years later. One of the things that happened in the merger was that all the seminaries were going to be independently supported. Now, in the old E&R side, the church took as part of its responsibility the support of the seminaries. So the denomination paid money to the seminaries every year to help support the seminaries. And literally after the merger went through, boom, all that money went away, like flipping a switch. All of a sudden, it has to be a voluntary donation from a church to these different seminaries in order to make the seminaries function. And so there are some folks involved in those seminaries back in the day that did not forget that very soon. The E&R side had to pay a pretty big price, and I think we're a little bit bitter. And in terms of numbers, it's interesting to think about numbers. It's also a little scary sometimes to think about numbers because numbers have changed a little bit since the early times. But here are the numbers of these two denominations as they came together. Let's see if I can. Here it is. Okay. So when the two churches came together, on the E&R side, there were 2,700 churches on the E&R side. They had 817,000 members, 2,800 ordained clergy, and 1,933 clergy that were actively serving congregations. On the congregational side, again, from 2,700 churches on the E&R side, there were 5,400 churches on the congregational side. So with twice as many churches, congregational churches, than there were E&R churches. The membership total on the congregational side was a little over 1.4 million. So actually on a per church basis, the E&R churches were larger. And that's because you had a lot of rural congregational churches in places like Iowa and other places around the Midwest that weren't that large. So you had a lot more congregational churches, but on average, the E&R churches were bigger. But the biggest churches around tended to be the congregational churches, even though there were some very large E&R churches. So the congregational side had 1.4 million members, 6,200 ordained clergy, and 3,600 actively serving clergy in the denomination when it was formed in 1960. So that's sort of the background of those two different denominations. At this point, I want to see if anyone has any questions before we talk about some of the things, because again, this is all about this whole merger process, which leads into discussions of polity and structure, which again, I'm happy to just keep talking about the denomination.
Well, I'm struck by the fact, which I find really bizarre, being a longtime Methodist, that it would appear that the Methodist tradition is more like the E&R than the congregational side.
Yeah,
whoever thought that? Which may explain why when there are merged churches in the Methodist Church, they tend to be Methodist Presbyterian churches that join, and they, in theory, have mutually opposed theology. In theory, at any rate.
But a lot more similarities in polity structure.
Yes.
Yeah, and you have, but this is one of the things that's important for a church like Bering joining the UCC. This is why for a church like Bering with a UMC history to join the UCC, it's actually not a particularly, I mean, it's one of these things, everything's independent in terms of each congregation. So whereas if you were to join a denomination like the UMC, all of a sudden there'd be all these things that change because they'd be mandated from the top down in terms of clergy, in terms of church organization, in terms of all these different things, in terms of money and buildings and this, that, and the other thing. It would be very clearly laid out. But to join the UCC, that's not the case at all. Because in the
what's
UCC,
going to be very interesting, what's going to be very interesting for Bering is suddenly the congregation is in charge and has to participate, and that's the forces in the Methodist Church were delegated to charge conferences, which we've never really held. We actually have worked on where the important end of decisions are made by the church conference, which is all of the membership voting, as opposed to the select body, which is called the charge conference. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the congregation takes on this responsibility.
Yeah, because again, the congregation in the UCC, the congregation's in charge of everything. That's why you can, your constitution, say whatever you want. You can have your liturgy do whatever it wants. You can, I mean, the congregation has total autonomy, and that's because the Congregationalists, when it was formed, said we will not join this unless this is the case. They
John,
demanded that it was the case. Yep.
You mentioned the Unitarians, but you didn't give us any background on the connection there. How about didn't they split with the Congregationalists?
Yes, what I said was a lot of congregational churches sort of tend Unitarian in their theology, Christian Unitarian in their theology. So, and that's still true to this day. The church I serve is certainly tends that way. Lynette can attest to that. And so that, I mean, again, you had this interesting movement in congregational theology where the Unitarians broke off in the early 19th century. But by the end of the 19th century and early 20th centuries, a lot of those theologies actually became much more similar. Now they have diverged since then, as most Unitarian churches, there are very few Unitarian Christian churches these days, for instance, whereas 60, 70 years ago, there would have been quite a few. My father was raised in a Unitarian Christian church, but the Unitarian church in our hometown was non-theist, very humanist in its orientation. And my father felt much more comfortable in a UCC church than he did in a Unitarian church, because they sort of evolved over time.
Yeah.
Well, at least we don't.
Yep.
We don't have to. We can let the Unitarians have the burden of Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Well,
we don't.
I mean, here's my some Emerson reading.
Oh
that I've
dear.
just been doing.
Oh dear. Well,
I have a question about, you mentioned last week there were like kind of 4 groups. What happened to the other 2? How did they enter into the situation?
So, yeah, it's a great question. So, on the ENR side, when the churches merged together, the Evangelical Synod, which again had a center of gravity around St. Louis, Missouri, and sort of up and down the Mississippi, in Texas, and also in parts of the Midwest, the Evangelical Synod joined with the German Reformed Church that was called the Reformed Church in the United States at the time. And that had its center of gravity in Pennsylvania, and that went back to the 18th century Pennsylvania, then into Ohio in the upper Midwest. And so those 2 churches merged together in 1934 to form the ENR Church. Now, on the other side, you had the Congregationalists, and then you had the Christian Connection. The Christian Connection joined with the Congregationalists in 1931, but since all those churches were congregational in their polity, all it really meant was they just sent delegates to the General Council. It didn't actually lead to any fundamental shift in anything in terms of the churches. Whereas the merger that formed the UCC actually did do that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And this is why, I mean, it's important to understand, because the conversation next week, I think you'll be fascinated by, because this is what's happened from 1957 onward. And I think it's as an important starting point for that conversation is to see where it started. And it started with these 2 different denominations coming together pretty uneasily. But there was a lot of changes from then to create what is an entirely different denomination today than was the case in 1957. It's also interesting to note, in 1957, when the merger happened, this made national newspapers, and it was something that was seen as as the leading edge of Christianity at the time. People wrote at the time about how this was going to change Protestant Christianity, how all these other denominations, this is just the thin end of the wedge. This is going to be a catalyst for all these organic unions going forward, and we're going to see an entirely different Protestant landscape in the next 30, 40 years. That was the thought.
And
again,
we did see an entirely different landscape, only it was this way instead of that way.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that start to factor in, one of which, again, when you think about when the merger happened, you had the beginnings of this neo-evangelical movement that we see. And one of the differences about this neo-evangelical movement as it arose in the 1940s, 50s, and then beyond, is that they considered all these mainline folks going to hell, and therefore an active conversion field, in a way that the mainline churches didn't see one another as that way. So whether you were UCC, Congregational, United Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Disciples of Christ, like in the mid 20th century, they're like, oh yeah, you're all Christian. We it's fine. Whereas the neo-evangelicals are like, no, 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 those people aren't Christian. They're all going to hell. We've got to go ask them if they've committed themselves to Christ. So you see this dramatic shift in that regard. And then the other thing that comes up in the UCC big time is the 1960s. Because the 1960s derails this great ecumenical project. Up until the 1960s, it's like, oh, the predominantly white Protestant establishment is going to get together and we're going to be the Protestant establishment and this is going to be so great. And then all of a sudden, things didn't happen that way. And how the church responded to the turmoil of the 1960s began a substantial sea change in the identity of the UCC as it evolved through this process. So that's why it's so important to see how the denomination has evolved since then, because it's an entirely different denomination than it was originally conceived to be. Again, it was supposed to be a denomination that would bring together all these other churches. And that didn't happen. They almost merged with the Disciples of Christ in the early 1980s. But that, the funny thing about that merger, so theoretically, the stated reason why that merger didn't go through was because of differences around communion and baptism. The Disciples of Christ, of course, do believers' baptism, and the vast majority of churches in the UCC tend to do infant baptism. Second thing was that the Disciples of Christ churches celebrate communion every Sunday and celebrate it in a very particular way, and the churches that are more reformed in their orientation celebrate communion slightly differently. So the excuse given at the time in the early 80s for why the merger didn't go through, or so I was told, is that, oh, well, there were differences over communion and baptism. And then the same person who's telling me this then pulled me aside and was like, actually, that's not really true. The reason why the merger didn't go through is because this is another thing we'll see next week. One of the things that happened to all mainline churches in the 1960s was that the denominational structure ballooned. And by 1980, the denominational structures were 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times bigger than they were in the 1950s.
Methodism.
And so what happened was, in the 1980s, when you had to start all of a sudden merge these denominations, all the people in those roles would lose their jobs. And so when they're like, oh, Jesus might want us to do this, but I got to put food on the table, and so we're not doing this. As happens.
Well, it's always money. In 1844, when the Methodist Church split, the biggest stumbling block was, unbelievably in the 21st century, was the Methodist Publishing House, which was hugely profitable. And the question was, who got the money?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why this was such a big. So just to give you an idea, I haven't seen statistics in a while, but back in 2007, I was on one of the national boards. And as part of being on one of these national boards, you have to see all the funding of all the national stuff. And back then, the endowment for what we then called local church ministries, which was a successor body to the American Home Missionary Society, back then they had like a $250 million endowment. And the endowment for the Foreign Missionary Group was like $150 million. And so to this day, the national setting of the UCC is largely funded by those old endowments that were given and collected in the 19th century and into the early 20th centuries, as you had these people collecting all this. And that's where the money for the national setting is. It doesn't come from the money that you give up to the conference. Lynette can give you the statistics for the South Central Conference about what percentage of the money that they get from OCWN they passed on this past year to national.
Yeah, I want to say historically it used to be like 14%. I think when I first came into the UCC, and I want to say it's more like 9 or 10 now.
Yeah. So, and just to give you how quickly this has changed, when I was starting all this old churchy process in Massachusetts, it was a big deal when that percentage crossed 50%, where they were retaining more than 50% of OCWM.
Yeah.
For decades and decades, the conferences would only retain, say, 20, 30% of the money, and 70% would get sent to national. Now, in the South Central Conference, 90% gets kept and only 10% goes to national. So national is funded not by OCWM funding. It's funded by these old endowments. So that's why there was this fight over this. because that's what you said, as David, that's what you said, that's where the money was. That's why they went to court over this, because these were big dollar figures that they weren't going to just walk away from. So it's
And the
Now-
folks on the Zoom who were at or streamed or in attendance at the 2019 special called General Conference can tell you that the first three topics were pensions, pensions, pensions.
Yeah, and the big thing was the conservatives made sure they could leave with their church property,
Mhm.
and then unbelievably they won. So we benefit from that. In a
Mhm.
way, I fear that we're a bit like, faring maybe a bit like the dog that finally caught the car.
Well, another interesting little twist on this merger is seeing how it broke down in different parts of the country. Now, one of the nice things about the merger when it happened is that the two denominations were really geographically compatible. So the great strength of the Congregationalists was in New England, in the upper Midwest, and then on the West Coast. And for the ENR Church, it was Pennsylvania, some also in the upper Midwest, but also, so that's where there was some overlap, and then all down sort of the central area, Mississippi area into Texas. So for the most part, say in New England or Pennsylvania, nothing changed because there weren't any ENR churches or congregational churches in those respective areas. In Texas, nearly all the churches were ENR churches. And so when the merger happened, there were only two congregational churches in the Houston area. One was the church that I served, First Congregational, and the other is Pilgrim Congregational, which is next to Texas Southern University. It was established by the American Missionary Association, which was an independent corporation of the congregational churches that later became part of what we call local church ministries. The American Missionary Association established historically Black colleges in the South and established historically Black congregational churches in the South and supported them actively. And so Pilgrim Church was started by the American Missionary Association back around 1900 as an all-Black congregational church in Houston, Texas. So First Congregational Church is not actually the First Congregational Church of Houston. The First Congregational Church of Houston is actually an all-Black congregation next to TSU. And there's an interesting reason why they named First Congregational. But anyway, so when the merger happened, there were two congregational churches in Houston, and all the other churches in the area were all these German ENR churches. And First Congregational has always been pretty Unitarian in its leanings. So Les Pugh, who was the minister of First Congregational in the 60s, he ended his career as a Unitarian minister. And Bob Tucker, who was the minister for 30 years, preaches all the time at Unitarian churches now and is very much a Unitarianist theology. So there's like a 40-some-odd year period where First Congregational was led by a functional Unitarian. And so that's in the midst of Texas ENR churches, which were most definitely not Unitarian. And so some of the things, one of the dynamics within Houston for a long time was, I remember hearing people talk about like some association meetings back in the day. I think Bob Tucker was telling me like back in like the 70s and 80s, some of these association meetings in Houston, like at certain points got to be like yelling matches over issues where they just did not agree on anything. Because you had these churches that were in places like Needville and other places that are rural churches, these rural ENR churches, and they had very little in common with First Congregational Church or Pilgrim Church. And so there was this real tension within the Houston Association among these different churches. And one of the things that Lynette and I have been talking about is how one of the things I think is a great thing is that the Houston Association looks nothing like it did back then. Absolutely nothing like it. The more conservative ENR churches, they've left the denomination. And it's one of these things, well, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Because they were all these really conservative churches that weren't on board with what the UCC is. And so, and then there was the church that Lynette helped plant here, Cathedral of Hope, which is now St. Peter United. And again, with Barron coming into the denomination, there was a church plant up in Spring that's led by a transgender pastor now. And there's another church in Spring that's just been started after one of the conservative folks left and the more liberal folks in the congregation were like, no, we're staying UCC. So you look at the association now, and the association now is entirely different. So the association you're coming into looks nothing like the association did back in the 70s and 80s. And I celebrate that because that shift that's happening here in Houston and that you are an integral part of happened in other parts of the country a long time ago.
John,
Yeah.
before you go on, I don't know the history, but I've always assumed that First Congregational might have been the first open and affirming church in Texas, or at least one of the first. Open and affirming is our version of reconciling.
I think it was the second, because I think Friends was around the same time. And I don't know whether First Congregational was before Friends or not, but Friends was around the same time.
I just share that because, you know, Bering, weren't they the first in Texas?
Yes, but you better bear in mind that we came to the game late, because to declare ourselves as a reconciling congregation was the equivalent of coming out.
Yeah.
And there was a great deal of resistance in the congregation to that, because if you know, they were little, you know, if you went to Bering, there was some people that, oh, that's the gay church.
Exactly.
And they were very, and some very strong congregation members resisted that for a long time.
But I think one of the synergies that's exciting is both of these churches, and therefore, you know, kind of the bedrock of the association, has a long-standing support of being open and affirming, reconciling, and just like the churches that that John mentioned. And so you really are becoming a part of a group of churches that will feel very familiar and with a lot of friends.
I thought it interesting that of course in the congregation there was this thing about Unitarians, the Christian Unitarians, which is an interesting concept in its own. But you know, Bering's path was begun by a pastor who, when he retired, went over to Canterbury.
Oh, interesting.
And so Ron Pogue is responsible for bringing the gays in and actually allowing them to serve in committees and the like, and then changing the liturgy to the rather high Episcopal Anglican liturgy. In theory, the liturgy from Salisbury, but he's the one who brought them in.
And well, I think tease John, because St. Paul's here in Houston always likes to pride itself on how liturgical it is. You know, they just have a big sanctuary. But I always said that Bering could, you know, match them toe for toe for any kind of liturgy.
Our standards have slipped. St. Paul's was, it was before you got here, Diane. St. Paul's was always sort of the higher church. But the thing about Bering is that we did it, but we made enough mistakes that people knew we weren't Episcopalian. We weren't Palmer.
Yeah, we now rap in church, you know. I mean,
we're going to have to go back to vesting the leaders and the like, and adding color. And incense.
Well, I think of
my favorite.
I think of like Cathedral of Hope in Dallas. I know is far more liturgical than say First Congregational. And I love seeing the images of their worship. I've never had a chance to worship there. I'd love to worship there at some point, but I haven't mentioned.
It's something, you know.
But the liturgy was very important in the day of AIDS. It was a constant thing, that it was always the same, and in particular, the notion of starting to do communion every Sunday, because this could be some person's last Sunday. I remember when I was growing up in a Methodist church in the 60s, they talked about having communion more frequently. But the problem was, how could you fit it in? And then there would be, well, we could cut down the sermon. So that didn't fly.
Yeah, it is interesting to see how
love preachers.
Yeah, I mean, there's I mean, in the UCC, there's definitely a move towards more frequent communion. It has been for a long time. So especially among younger generation of clergy, and that's all the stuff we'll talk about next week, where all those old battles that people cared about for a long time. Like I talked to my colleagues in ministry who are my age. None of them have ever heard of this stuff. They haven't even heard of it. They haven't heard of it. It's totally alien to them that would be the case, because the denomination they joined and became ordained in was the UCC. And so that's why the story next week is important, but there still are these little hangovers where it's like, why is a church called like First Congregational? And and again, for First Congregational in Houston, because of those divisions within the association, that was one of the reasons why the church was reluctant to embrace UCC as an identity, because they wanted to hold on to the congregational side because they felt so different than the ENR churches that were around them. And so one of the ways to hold on to that New England identity, because there were so many transplants in the congregation from New England, in order to hold on to that New England identity, they really wanted to hold on to that name Congregational. And I even brought up in a sermon on Sunday that I'm like, well, are we going to change the name at some point?
Yeah.
Surprised you didn't get
Well,
beat
yeah.
up on that one.
That's
You
a little
talk
way.
about
You know,
name, you talk about names too. When the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Church merged in the late 60s, the reason United got put into the title was because Evangelical United Brethren felt like they were being swallowed up by the Methodist Church. And for a fact, in a lot of ways, that did happen, because a lot of their congregations were very small and they were in the same area as the Methodist Church. And so they closed them.
well, the church my sister served after her was in Fort Collins, Colorado, and it had been an EUB church, and they were older than the First United Methodist Church. So God love them, they sent a delegation to First Methodist, suggesting that they change their name because they weren't first. And to this day, there is Christ United Methodist Church and First United Methodist Church.
But, even though John said that, FCC, or First Congregational, was kind of reluctant to become a part of the UCC, I can tell you, because I was involved in the association leadership and in the conference, they have the longest, they're one of the biggest supporters of the association and the conference that we have locally, First Congregational, more than all the ENRs.
Right. That's why the discussion of the name sort of is not reflective of how involved the congregation is in the UCC and how much it cares about the UCC. The UCC identity is big because the UCC identity has always resonated in many ways with First Congregational's identity. Yeah. First Congregational, and I'll address that story next week. But like, there's the progressive identity of the UCC that emerged from the merger to the present day, again, has always felt very comfortable and at home with First Congregational. So it's always been supportive.
If I can ask a question, John, will you
Sure,
be discussing any of the role of race? Because race
next week
is okay, because race is essential at the center core of the United Methodist Church, particularly from 1844 through the merger in 1930 and the reunion and like the segregation that was started when the North and the South came back together, and then going away sort of when the EUB came in.
So next week, one of the big things that starts to shift the denomination, the character of the denomination, is the civil rights movement and the way in which the denomination responded to the civil rights movement. So that all comes up next week, and the implications. Again, the largest church in the entire United Church of Christ. You know what the largest church in the UCC is? It's Trinity UCC in the south side of Chicago, led by Otis Moss III. That's the largest church in the denomination. It's got 8,000 members. Again, the UCC has evolved a lot from its roots when it was established. And we'll go over all that stuff next week because it's pretty interesting stuff. So great. Well, we're sort of at our time. I don't know if they're
awesome. Anything you just need to absolutely have to say before we end tonight? Okay, thank you, John. That's really thank you. This is very engaging, very interesting.
He loves all this stuff.
Each denomination. I mean, there's all. I love history because this history shows up in weird ways. And so knowing the history, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I see that. So it's interesting to wrap your head around it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
We will
thank you.
See you next week.
Yes. Yep. See you next week. All right. Take care.
All right. Thank you, everyone.